Let's begin with an introduction to Excel's macro recorder. And so that feature is tucked away on Excel's view menu. And so you may not have noticed before, the macros command is the last command at the right on the view menu. And if we pull down that macros command, we'll then see that there's a choice to record the macro. Now, when we turn on the macro recorder, not every action we take is going to get recorded. Only actions that actually affect the workbook itself or the worksheet. So when you're browsing, if you turn on a macro recorder and then you're kind of tooling through the menus, it's not going to keep track that you activated this menu or that menu. What it instead, when things get recorded, is when you actually carry out something that changes the workbook in some fashion. So moving around in the menus doesn't change the workbook. Typing some data, saving the file, rearranging the windows, adding a sheet, and so on, those types of actions do change the workbook. And so that's the type of actions that then get saved or get transcribed into programming code for us by the macro recorder. But let's just do a simple example. If you pick up pretty much any book about programming, the first exercise is often some riff on making the macro or the script or the programming code return the words "Hello World." And so we'll do something similar here to just get our feet wet and see what the process is from start to finish on creating a macro by way of the macro recorder. Step 1, we're going to click on any cell within our worksheet. Step 2, we'll choose the macros command from the view menu. And we want the bottom portion of the macros command. There's a top portion and a bottom portion. We want the bottom portion here with the arrow so that we can then see the menu that pops down. That step 3 there is the choice for record macro. That brings up a record macro dialog box. And so step 4, we'll give our macro a name. We'll call it hello. And then step 5, we want to store our macro in a special place that's known as the personal macro workbook. What's unique about this workbook, it's a hidden workbook that Excel manages on its own. Any macros that you place within it become available to you to use with all your future Excel workbooks. So anything that you place in the personal macro workbook will just always be an extension of your Excel environment. So step 6, there's a description field where we can describe what our macro does, because sometimes just based on the name we might not remember what the macro does. So we can give it a description. Step 7, when we click OK, it's kind of like clicking the record button on our phone to record some video, much the same idea. So Excel then starts watching to see if you're making any changes that affect the worksheet. So step 8 there, we're going to type in the words "Hello World," and we'll press Enter. When we initiate the macro recorder, a new shortcut will appear at the bottom of our screen as evidenced by step 9. So a stop recording button will appear down on the status bar next to where it says ready. Now, if for some reason that status bar is not present on your screen, or if you don't see that button there, you would also be able to go back to the macros menu, and where it says record macro, that would have changed at this point with the macro recorder running to be a stop recording button. But typically you'll find it easier to click that square at the bottom of the screen. The other benefit to that square is it serves as a reminder that the macro recorder is on. Many times it can be easy to forget to turn the macro recorder off, and so we want to make sure that we turn it on, carry out our work, and then turn it off so we don't record extraneous items in our macro. So once we've turned off the macro recorder, step 10 there, we will once again go back to the view menu if needed. Step 11, we'll click the top portion of the macros button. That brings up a macro dialog box. That will then give us a list of the macros in our workbook. So step 12 there, we'll click on the name of our macro, which is our hello macro. Step 13, we'll click run. And at that point, we should see the words "Hello World" appear in another worksheet cell. To try this out here, I've got a blank workbook and my cursor is in cell A1. So I'm going to go to the view menu. Going to go then to the macros command and come down and then choose record macro. So when I make that choice, that brings up the record macro dialog box. I'll give the macro a name. I cannot have any spaces in the name. If I try to type a name that has any invalid characters, Excel will stop me when I click OK. So you do need to keep the words all contiguous, maybe as compound words, or you can use an underscore in place of a space. There's an enticing spot here for the shortcut key. We want to leave that blank because that can cause more problems than it solves. I'll show you once we have vetted our macro and we're sure that it works properly, how we can go back in and add a shortcut key in that fashion as we wish. But there's also another, I think, better way to create keyboard shortcuts for macros that we'll get to. So we're going to store our macro in the personal macro workbook. Notice we pull this list down, we could store it in a new workbook or the workbook that we're currently in. And we'll have reasons to save them in other workbooks, but many of our macros are just going to be things to help us automate repetitive tasks we find ourselves carrying out over and over again. And so if we keep them in the personal macro workbook, then they'll always be at the ready for us to run when we're working in Excel. So we'll call this my first Excel macro. And then we'll click OK. So at this point, the macro recorder is recording. If I'm not sure, I can go back to the macros command and notice that there then says stop recording. And so if I'm navigating through the menus, nothing's getting recorded yet. I haven't made any changes that affect the worksheet or the workbook. So in cell A1, we're going to type the word hello, put the word world, exclamation mark, we'll press enter. And then at this point, we'll click the stop recording button. So that turned off the macro recorder. And from start to finish, that's our process of recording a macro. To play the macro back, we're going to go back to the View menu if needed. Over to the right, going to our macros command here. So when we click on that, it brings up a list of our macros. And so here is the hello macro. I can click on that. I can choose run. And notice I put the words hello world there. So any cell that I go to now, I go to macros, I choose hello, and I click run. It carries out that task. Now, this particular macro is more about just kind of getting a sense of what the steps are, but we'll find that we can add other macros that can be useful to us and then enhance Excel. So in many cases, if we wish there was a way to do this more efficiently, you can often create a macro that will accomplish that for you.